We work on other topics like housing, consumer rights, immigrants' rights. We have a budget and tax center. So a lot of issues that affect people who are living in poverty. But I specialize in education, and just really excited to be here to talk about this guidance letter, which I know sounds strange. It's hard to get excited for a guidance letter usually, but this is, I think, a particularly interesting one, and one that's completely applicable to what's happening here right now. And so this is a guidance letter that's about the voluntary use of race to achieve diversity and avoid racially isolated schools in elementary and secondary education. So this guidance letter really has its roots in the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education, which I'm sure everyone has heard a ton about. I'd like to read a little bit from that case because I think it's really the foundation of everything that we're going to talk about here today. In the case, we recognize that education is probably the most important function of state and local governments. It's the very foundation of good citizenship, and that providing students with diverse, inclusive educational opportunities from an early age is crucial to achieving the nation's educational and civic goals. And that it's also pivotal to sustaining our political and cultural heritage as a nation of immigrants, a diverse nation, that our strengths come from having people of different races, creeds, and cultures uniting in commitment to the freedom of all. The court has found, and I think Dr. Mickelson will talk about the research on this, but the court has accepted a lot of this research that racially diverse schools provide incalculable educational and civic benefits. They promote cross-racial understanding, break down racial and other stereotypes, eliminate bias and prejudice. And then on the other hand, schools that lack diversity, that are racially isolated, they often fail to provide the full range of benefits that K-12 schools can offer. So, the K-12 achievement at schools that are racially isolated often lags behind that of other schools. Racially isolated schools often have less effective teachers, higher teacher turnover rates, fewer resources, inferior facilities, and other educational resources. So the court has found that it's really a compelling interest that you have in achieving diversity in schools. And in 2007, there was a case called Parents Involved, which involved a challenge to the integration efforts in Seattle schools and in Louisville schools. And that case really cast a lot of doubt on the use of race in schools in a lot of people's mind. I think some school districts came out of that ruling and wondered, can we do anything to try to achieve diversity? And so that's why this guidance is particularly important, because it shows that yes, we can. What happened in those particular cases were that it wasn't that you couldn't take any affirmative steps to achieve diversity, it was that the way that those school districts went about it wasn't narrowly tailored enough to achieve that interest. So what this guidance does is lay out some particular, really specific ways of how you can achieve that. But there are some kind of guiding principles that have to be established when you go about that. I think one is that there needs to be some sort of findings of fact in your school district about why racial diversity or any kind of diversity is going to be important to your schools. Why is it going to benefit your schools? So you don't want to start necessarily with just the assumption that that's going to be the case. You want to have some findings of fact. And I think that it's great that you have people like Dr. Mickelson here who can really explain how these benefits accrue to students. So it's important in any student assignment plan to kind of start with that, just to show why it's going to be beneficial to your particular schools. It's also important that you first consider race-neutral ways of achieving integration, and because the court is going to look, it's going to have the highest level of scrutiny over anything that classifies people based on race, and it's sort of, maybe it flips some things on its head, but it's because of the history of legal discrimination that has occurred in this country that any kind of use of race in the law is going to be viewed very suspect, even if it is to affirmatively benefit any particular race. It's going to be something that's going to be scrutinized very heavily. So it's important to first consider any race-neutral alternatives that may exist. And then another thing that it does is the sort of last resort to achieving integration is to look at the race of an individual student. And again, it's because of that history of discrimination in our country that the court is going to look suspiciously at, if you're just saying that we're going to only look at someone's race and making a determination about where they go to school or almost any other decision, that has the potential for being discriminatory. So there are a lot of still good ways to achieve diversity. I think that the reason why people had some doubt in it was because it's a very complicated case, the Seattle schools case, where there was an opinion of the court written by Justice Roberts that had the famous line, "The way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race." And so a lot of people thought that meant we can't use race at all, even to alleviate the historical impact of previous discrimination. But the portion, and usually, as a law student, I would usually read the main opinion, and then if I ran out of time, I wouldn't read the concurrence or dissenting opinions. But in this case, the concurring opinion is really important because Justice Kennedy is the swing vote. So he didn't go so far as that. He thought that there were some really good, compelling reasons for why you want to have diversity in schools, and that you may need to consider race in some broader context, not in the individual level. So his opinion is really important, and that's really what this guidance letter focuses on. So I don't want to get too much into the details of the case. I want to get to some of the examples of ways that you can try to achieve diversity in a school district. Number one is in determining where you're going to locate particular schools if you open a new school, or where you're going to have particular programs be located. So you could have it. You can draw new districts that draw people from one of the things that's kind of confusing about this before I get into the super specific examples is that the guidance really talks a lot about using socioeconomic status as a proxy for achieving racial diversity. And I don't mean to be insensitive. I come from Virginia Beach, where this thing seems to have the assumption that you can achieve racial diversity by using socioeconomic status. And where I'm from, everybody was a middle-class military area where there are people of all different races, and trying to use socioeconomic status as a proxy for a race is not going to work very well in a place like that. It may in some other places, but so please excuse me if I keep using them interchangeably, because the guidance does. I understand that those two things don't always overlap. But the guidance really does seem to have a preference for trying to use something like socioeconomic status to achieve diversity before you use racial classifications. So, if you're coming up with a location for a new school, you could try to draw in a way that's going to draw students from different socioeconomic groups. You can also really, this is one of the more, I think, stronger possibilities in drawing the zones, because you can consider the racial characteristics of a large geographic area when trying to achieve diversity and where your schools are located in another zone, because then you're treating everyone in that area the same regardless of what their race is. So it's okay to consider race in that larger context. Again, they just want it's when it gets down to the individual level that it becomes more heavily scrutinized by the courts. Same thing with if you want to have a special academic program like a magnet school or an IB school or something like that. You could try to locate it in an area that has a history of being low performing, or a history of racial isolation, or maybe low income status. It's fine to expressly include the racial characteristics of a particular geographic area when you're trying to figure out how to draw these zones. Same thing with grade realignment or feeder patterns. So grade realignment means, say you have two K-5 schools. One is heavily either one race or one socioeconomic status. One is another, and they're completely separate. You could divide those schools up and have one be a K-2 school, one be a K-5 school, and have them both be integrated. That would be an acceptable way to achieve integration. Same thing with feeder patterns. You could have, different racially isolated schools feed into different middle schools in a way that thwarts that racial isolation. And again, you always have to show statistics of why it's going to work, why it's actually going to achieve diversity, and why it's going to have educational benefits, but you can always do this. So, same thing with, I mentioned the attendance zones, which is sort of similar to the siting area, where you build a new school. You can kind of redraw the attendance zones in a way that looks at socioeconomic status. I think it's important to look at socioeconomic status first, and then look at the racial characteristics of the area as well. You do want to consider race-neutral requirements in coming up with these attendance zones. So, and some of these are going to be maybe things that you've historically considered here, so you don't want to completely get rid of those. Things like equalizing the enrollment sizes, minimizing travel times, making it so some people can walk to school if they need to, ensuring some kind of peer continuity, staying with your classmates. Sometimes people have priorities for siblings and things like that. It's important to keep considering how you can maintain those policies while also going towards that compelling interest of having a diverse school. Finally, this one's maybe a little more complicated, and I'll admit I'm somewhat biased because it's something that happened in Wake County. There's things that have like school choice and open enrollment, and in Wake County it was called controlled choice. So the idea was that students could apply to schools throughout the county, and then you can use different factors in figuring out how to assign students. So that became very complicated in a place as big as Wake County in terms of the way people were going to have to travel all over the place. It became very politically difficult to try to figure out how to weight all the different things. You can just hook me if you need to, because this is a long topic. Okay.
We're going to come back.
Okay.
We're going to come back.
All right, so let's just wrap this part up right now. So, okay, one other thing just to remember is that you can have a random lottery system that draws people just from the top 25% of each class or something like that for the magnet schools. So that way, if you had a bunch of racially isolated elementary schools and you're just taking people from the top 25% of each, you would achieve integration. So that method seems very promising and maybe a little bit easier to administer. So sorry for carrying on. I'm just excited about the topic.